Okay, we're live.
We're live? Oh, right. Yes. Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Tarun Singh, editor of the Gollancz Book of South Asian Science Fiction, Volume 2. First of all, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the panelists and the audience. In the session to follow, we will try and introduce to you the volume just released. We're very lucky to have with us some of the eminent contributors, and let me very briefly introduce these contributors to you. So Manjula Padmanabhan is an author, playwright, and cartoonist, and details regarding her career can be found in the bio note, which you will find at the end of the volume. So I will not go into details. Suki is, of course, such a well-known figure, in a way, needs no introduction. But yes, besides that, she's very well-known for plays and like, of course, Harvest, and novels like, of course, Escape and The Island of Lost Girls. So, Manjula, welcome. Then we have Vandana Singh with us, who's, of course, also an extremely well-known writer of science fiction from our area. So she's a physics professor and particle physicist by training. And yeah, there are, again, details which you can find in the bio notes, but her, collection, Ambiguity, Machines, and Other Stories, has been very well received and included in several, it was a finalist for the Crossword Book Award and the Philip K. Dick Award. So welcome, Vandana. Then we have with us Usman Malik, who's, of course, a very distinguished author, and he's Pakistani American, and his short fiction has been reprinted in so many best of year anthologies. I won't even begin listing the names of these anthologies, but yeah, again, details in the bio note. But he has won the Bram Stoker Award as well as the British Fantasy Award. So very pleased to have you with us, Usman, who seems to have temporarily vanished, but great his return. Okay, then we have Anil Menon, who's, of course, a veteran in the field. Anil has written short stories, he's written novels. Half of what I say is the most recent of his novels. I see Usman is, he's likely to be back with us soon. So Anil's work includes, yes, a collection of short fiction, which is soon to appear, and Hachette India, I think, are the publishers. So welcome, Anil. Usman, welcome. I just read out your bio note in absentia, but that's all right. I hope,
No, we can't see Usman.
But I hope he can hear us and, yeah, eventually be part of the discussion. We are just plowing on regardless. Right, so this is the moment when actually we were supposed to kind of, virtually launch the volume. So
but we need Usman.
Usman, where are you? Okay, hold on then a few seconds to await his return. I'll go on with my preliminary remarks because, again, time is short. So, first of all, to begin with, I'll refer back to an essay written by Arundhati Roy in 2020, where she described the pandemic, which we're still going through, as a portal, an event that would reshape the world as we know it, while ushering us into then a completely different space. This collective rewiring has not quite come to pass, as Kim Stanley Robinson recently observed, though in many ways the normal has been destabilized and a new normal instituted in its place. Our own anthology was planned before 2019, so the focus was not on the reality of the pandemic, except in a few instances, such as Kaiser Huck's speculative poem, 2020 NKRV, which ironically envisages the spread of a karuna or compassion virus, which nation states then try to control. And Sami Ahmed Khan's Biryani Bagh, in which flavorsome biryani unexpectedly becomes an SF novum or new idea. However, a range of themes and issues are broached in this volume, which extends the scope of the first volume, both in terms of the geographical and cultural diversity. We are writing from Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and the Tibetan community in exile. We have translations from Marathi as well as Bengali. The porosity of boundaries between science fiction, horror, and high concept fantasy and fabulation is also acknowledged here. We hope Volume 3 will enable a further expansion of our ambit. Darko Suvin famously defined science fiction as a mode of critical daydreaming, underlining the elements of cognition and estrangement in SF narratives. This is well known. Techniques such as extrapolation and speculation are key to the genre's projection of concerns of the present into the future or other spaces. Yet the potentialities involved in such futuristic representations are very much of the moment, very much of our time, as Stephen Shaviro has shown. So I'd like to firstly ask the panel if they have self-consciously reflected on placing their own work in the spectrum from hard SF to soft SF, or allied genres such as high concept fantasy, horror, the weird, or fantastica / spec fic in general. So who would like to start? Maybe Vandana could be the first to take this, given that she has a speculative manifesto. Yes.
Thank you, Tarun, for that kind introduction as well. I honestly, I don't self-consciously write in a genre. It really is the story that tells me which direction to take, and it's only in hindsight that I figure out the taxonomy of my writing. Um, so, so to me, it would actually be a problem for my muse if I tried to like fit my story in a box from the get-go. So I find that suppresses my creativity. So I just let the story take me wherever it will, and then later on, if I feel like it, or if other people want to, they can put me in a category or put that story in a category. But yeah, that's the way I approach it.
Anil, I think you should go next.
So yeah, I was reading a lot of, when I began writing fiction, I was reading a lot of hard SF. And my background as a technologist, a technology guy, that definitely influenced the early stories I was writing. So there's generally a feeling that most of fiction doesn't seem to be talking about it. They don't seem to be realizing just what havoc technology is going to cause to everything that we do. Now, there's a kind of an innocence. In a way, it's like if you read Jane Austen, you would never know that Waterloo was happening. And there was that feeling when I read fiction, that there was enormous changes coming down the pipe, and which has happened actually. But people were sort of oblivious to it, and the fiction people who should be aware of it, writers, were kind of oblivious to it, except for this small group of writers, generally on the margins of literature as such. Though they, of course, are very popular. But as I began writing, as I continue to write, I began to learn a lot more about fiction, the way fiction works and doesn't work. And I began to think a lot about it. And then gradually the interest in the external world began to fade a bit. And I became convinced that it was about exploring different kinds of minds. And speculative fiction has a great opportunity here. Because again, regular fiction focuses on the human mind primarily. But there are other kinds of minds that speculative fiction, states of mind at least, even for humans, that speculative fiction is very good at. So it became much more internal it became a little metafictional, it became political. So that it kind of moved away from the hard SF. In fact, I read very little of hard SF as such now. But the basic interest in terms of looking at minds, and not just human minds, that has remained.
Thank you, Anil. Manjula, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think I would say by contrast, because I don't come from a technical background, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a technologist. I would say that I would adore to write hard fiction, hard SF, but I can't. And so in many ways, it's a bit like what they say about circus horses. How do you get a circus horse to dance? You don't give the horse the music, you set the music to the horse. And so in a similar way, I write what I can, and I write around the issues that I can't write about. So I would say that that's how I manage the hard soft issue.
Thank you, Manjula. Usman, can you hear us? Can you join the discussion?
Usman's microphone is off and we can't see
Your
Usman.
microphone is muted and we can't see you, but are you able to hear us? I think there may be some technical issues there.
Yeah.
We can come back to Usman if the connection is re-established a little later. Usman,
Yeah.
any luck? Oh no, he's I think trying to reconnect.
He's trying.
Okay, Usman, let us know when you're. Oh yeah, there you are. Okay.
But there you are. There you are. You're in a car.
Just unmute, Usman. Unmute. We can't hear you.
He's in a car or in a spaceship. One of the two.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
go ahead. We can hear you. We can hear you. Just
I was
keep
going
talking.
to the airport to fly, and I pulled over to do this.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Yeah. So, you know, StreamYard sometimes doesn't quite work without Wi-Fi that well, and I'm actually I was traveling, so I had to rely on a lack of Wi-Fi. Anyway, so you know, if you guys can hear,
we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
You can. Talking about fiction and
we've lost him. Tarun, I think we'll go ahead, and I think we need to show our book.
Okay, that can be done in the meantime, because Usman is at an airport, it seems, so you may not be able to.
This is a reveal.
So this is the official launch, the release of the book. Meanwhile, Usman seems to be trying to get back into the picture.
When he comes back on,
we've got a screenshot of that. Yeah. So the book is out in the world. Usman, back to you.
Yep. So Tarun, I think you go ahead, because Usman will join us when he can.
Okay, Usman, we are still awaiting your contribution. We'll just
can you
sort of.
At all?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm having technical issues.
So
I hope that.
He's got Wi-Fi.
That for me, any times I approach fiction, I'm approaching it from an affect point of view. I'm looking for a particular affect, whether it's emotional or psychological, or even literary at times. So often a character situation comes to me that I want to write about, and for me, the affect or the tone is pretty much everything I'm going for. I've done maybe a couple of realist stories, and most of them fall in. Most of the others fall in the speculative realm. But if I were to pin myself down, I think I mostly write dark fiction.
Thank you, Usman. Okay, great. I'm glad we were able to hear you on this very important, sort of subject. So I'll go on. So South Asian science fiction, now homing in more on the book's main focus area. So South Asian science fiction has from the outset sought various routes to alternative futures, whether through rebellion, out and out rebellion, as in Kailash Chandra Dutt's story published in 1835, or utopian projection, as in Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussein's 1905 story, Sultana's Dream. So these are now, I'm going to sort of just read out a set of interrelated questions, general questions, which anyone can feel free to respond to. So in the panel's view, has South Asian science fiction overcome the ghosts of the colonial past? Or are we still contending with that vexed inheritance till this day in the context of skewed development, social inequality, and the tendency towards centralized power structures? Has South Asian science fiction, and your work in particular, devised adequate metaphors to contend with such contemporary injustices in both the human and non-human worlds? Related question, can we think of South Asian science fiction as joining the ranks of the time rebels, such as Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, and the protest movements in South Asia today. Can South Asian science fiction become a mode of intellectual resistance in its assumption of responsibility to future generations to come? So not just to our contemporary moment, but to future generations to come. And this especially so in the face of the loss of biodiversity, climate change, and the looming threat of ecological collapse. So who would like to take this first? You can see Vandana smiling.
I think I'd like to
Vandana.
go. I'd like to
Manjula,
go
please.
Because as someone who assisted in the way the book was structured, I'd like to say that from my perspective as an assistant to Tarun, I would say that we are not merely we have not in any way struggled out of our colonial hangups, but that it's not just in science fiction, in fiction in general, in not as fiction and non-fiction, we are still by the even when I say we, I feel self-conscious. Who do we mean by we? We in South Asia, in India, and the different countries of South Asia, we are still, all the many different we's are still trying to understand who we are and what we are as against the colonial past and the post-colonial present. So the future is still very much a kind of vague, misty space. And I think what we are trying to do with what we have tried to do with this anthology is to try and, in a sense, force march Indian or South Asian. I'm sorry to only refer to India. I didn't mean to do that. But we need to push forward beyond the current moment because it is so important to think beyond our current moment. So anyway, go. You go.
Thanks for that. Thank you. Who would like to go next? Vandana?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Manjula said, that I do not think that we have thrown off the shackles of the colonial past. For one thing, the colonial, the colonizers' model of development is what we have adopted full on, in South Asia. And we can see that because as we speak today on the eve of the UN Climate Summit, the Hasdeo Aranya, one of the largest contiguous forests in India, is being razed down for coal mining. And many people might be aware of the Adivasis protest march on that issue. So despite all of these disasters unfolding before us, climate change and biodiversity loss and increasing social inequality, we are still going on the path that that the colonizers, along the philosophy of the colonizers, we have adopted it, we have embraced it, and if that's not colonialism at its heart, then I don't know what it is. We have succumbed to it. And therefore, whatever resistance there is, whether it's through people's own initiatives on the ground, which is of key importance, but also in the literary sense, if we can, at least for the duration of the story, that space-time pocket that the story represents, at least in that we can try to, in the words of Ursula Le Guin, remember freedom, and freedom from the colonial paradigm, from the dominant development paradigm, from this destructive path, then that's something. And I think that, that's something I'm very interested in. It's not for me to dictate what other writers do, but that is my interest and passion.
Thank you, Vandana. Yes, Anil?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I would agree with Vandana that we seem to be laboring under the weight of history. But I think the way we work and the way we explain our work are two different things. And it's very often we find that the explanations come long after the work is done. And it's tempting to believe that the explanations are actually accurate. I do not think that we understand why we write the stories we do while we are writing them. Later on, the much older self, the much more experienced self, the self that hasn't written the story, sits and talks about it, right? And because it is in control of the mic, we get the feeling that we have actually an explanation of how the story came to be written. And I think that is not quite the case. We write out of some feelings, some curiosity, some interest, and then it's forgotten. So when I read the stories that we see today, I get the sense of a great disquiet, a great sorrow, a great sadness, worry, anxiety, and that I find interesting. I do not think writers make for very good thinkers in general. In general, that they're not good economists, they're not good biologists, they're not good sociologists. They often do not have the training for thinking about large systems, but they're very good at feeling the world, and they're like the canaries in the coal mine. And if they are in anguish, if they are suffering, if they feel the world is in trouble, I don't think we should worry too much about what the reasons they give for why the world is so, but we should note that we should take that feeling very seriously, right? So I would say that we kind of register what the world is feeling at this point, and it's not a good picture as far as fiction is concerned. So in my own work, I find that when I try to think through problems, I usually end up writing bad stories. Whereas if I just let the story happen, it often ends up being what I really wanted to say. So my point would be that I think we are feeling the world. We are like the antennae, the world's antennae. And it's interesting what we are feeling. But for the actual solutions, they must come from outside of literature. I do not think that literature itself has many solutions to offer.
Okay, interesting.
Tarun, I want to share a message that I got on email from Usman Malik. He says, "Sorry guys, having unanticipated technical issues. I would call this a space-time anomaly that he's experiencing. Anyway, I'm about to fly and on the way to the airport, and I was hoping to do this before I got there. Please forgive my absence, and I look forward to watching the panel later." So he's not going to be with us.
This never happens in fiction.
Right.
In fiction, technology always works.
Right. Of course, we know that.
So these are the unanticipated sort of problems which technology can pose. But we may be able to host Usman at a subsequent session, because this is a series, it seems. So Hachette are really interested in hearing authors from the volumes speak, and so this is just the opening event and a launch event at that. So we'll look forward to perhaps hosting Usman again at a future point, which is more convenient to him. So that brings me then to the next part of the session. Can you please choose some suitable paragraphs to read from the particular contribution to this video, so that
I think Anil should go first.
The audience.
That's it, Manjula. Put me on the spot.
Yes,
you're ready. Bailey's watch. So Anil,
I'll read about a couple of paragraphs. Right?
Okay. And just explain the context, because now we have time. We have time. Yeah. That's right.
So this is one of the early stories that I've written, and I had never been able to finish it to my satisfaction until Tarun asked me for a story, and then I kind of found the solution that I wanted. It's a found artifact story, which is one of the most popular tropes in science fiction, which if somebody finds something, and it's a very mysterious something, and figuring out what that something is the pleasure of the story. So this is a found artifact story, and it's called Paley's Watch. William Paley was the theologian who proposed that the world is so beautifully designed, it must have a designer. This takes off on his idea. Let me just... It's called Paley's Watch. The American spirit found the artifact in the Gulf of Alaska, about 50 miles off the coastline, not too far from the port at Sitka. It had been dredged up by a trawler pod set for halibut. Paley, one of the fishermen, spotted the object sparkling against the blood-black deck, and the men gathered at the bridge's triumphant shout. It was a set of nested funnels. Each conical layer sparkled with what appeared to be moving dots of light. The artifact was about the size of a can of soup, but its weight kept changing, making the thing feel uncomfortably alive, like holding a cat. The men quickly returned the artifact to Paley. So I'll stop there.
Oh, that's it. Oh, you can go on for a bit. Actually, we have time. As I mentioned, we just, so since Usman is not with us, so we're actually in a comfortable space. If you like to go on for a bit, you can, or would you prefer to stop?
Maybe a little bit more.
A little bit more, please.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. And all of you, this applies to everyone. Yeah, we have time. And it gives more of a flavor again. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. At first, they thought it was junk from one of the many cruise ships that plied the area. But even junk is something. This looked like nothing they had seen before. They had a college boy in their midst, one Tommy Kumagai. And they got the 19-year-old to take a look. Hey, that's Dini's surface, said Tommy. No, it ain't, rolled Paley. It's mine. I found it. Relax, Paley. I meant it looks like Dini's surface. It's a topological manifold. A topless what? Asked the captain, eyeing the curious crew. At his glance, they all returned to work, except for Paley. Manifold, a surface with smooth curvature, like those sculptures with those weird holes and lumps. If you know the curvature of a manifold, you know everything about it. A sphere has positive, constant curvature. That's what makes it a sphere. A Dini surface is a pseudosphere. There's constant negative curvature. If you draw a triangle, thanks, Professor. Paley spat on the deck. So it's just a toy, innit? The Liverpudlian expat looked ready to throw it back into the ocean. Tommy hesitated. Don't know, Paley. It doesn't look like it's been made for giggles. Might be valuable. Never laid nothing. Never laid eyes on nothing like it. I'll stop.
Okay.
Oh, thanks very much.
Thank
Before
you.
we move
That
to the
makes
next,
a big difference.
before we move to the next reading, so since we have some time, I just thought I might ask you a little bit more about this particular story, since it's a story with so many layers to it, and I'm still discovering more levels, as it were, each time I read it. So the metafictional aspect, which you did allude to during your preliminary remarks, could you, especially with respect to this whole question of some of the analogies between, as it were, scientific discovery and literary composition, as it were, so the narratological, as it were, dynamic.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit about that?
One of the curious things that I feel about physics is that it's like those weird. It's not a story, but it's one of those weird texts that creates the world as it talks about it. You know, so you're worrying about, say, a new particle, and it seems completely hypothetical. And it can't exist really. Anybody is introduced to solve some minuscule problem. And then you find that maybe 10 years later, the particle has been found. You know, whether it has been found or whether the world has created it out of the theory, right? Like now we have the theory that is consistent, it's complete. So the world just manifests it. That aspect of physics, whether it is generative in some respects and not just descriptive, right, has always interested me, and especially in the context of like elementary physics. You find that many of the theories that like string theory, right now has no proof, but I have a strong suspicion the universe is going to manifest string theory just because the theory is so beautiful and well developed. You know, so the sense of the physics being a text that is being written and creates what is written has always interested me. And in this story, it kind of reflects on that, where one of the characters, actually one of the failed characters, a character who doesn't get his PhD, who's going to lose out, he actually spots this curiosity and he's trying to tell this smart, hyper smart physics, like a Feynman-like character, what he's seen in physics, and the guy is too busy to listen to him until the very end, when he realizes that maybe this guy was right. You know?
Yeah, that's the irony. That's the very profound irony. Thank you, Anil. Yes, that gives us some further food for thought and reflection as we return to this real gem of a story. Who'd like to go next?
Vandana.
Vandana. Okay, yeah, it's a physicist, so we have people really into physics. But Vandana's story, beautiful story, narrative at with so many dimensions. So please.
I just want to mention one quick thing before I start, which is that, Anil, I actually wrote a short story on exactly that theme, which is in my my second collection. So I hear you on that.
Wait, which story was that?
It was called Peripateia.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
We'll look
so
it up. Yeah, thank you for that reference. Okay.
okay, so I'm going to read from my story is called A Different Sea. And I think I'm just going to read from the beginning and maybe like 2 or 3 paragraphs. And I apologize in advance because my neighbor has been mowing his lawn, and every once in a while that sound overwhelms us, might overwhelm us. Okay.
No.
All right. So here goes. Rasika saw the moths when she was almost home. A moist, cold, glimmering dark had fallen. The lights from the bus were 2 watery yellow beams. On the narrow bridge that connected the mainland to the island, the single street light was out. Only the sea glimmered faintly in the starlight. When the bus turned into the lane from the bridge, the moths suddenly appeared, their wings fluttering delicately. There was a rain mist, a veil of moisture over the ground, from which the moths seemed to rise as though woven hurriedly from water and magic. Their wings were tattered, as if the weaver had not been able to pay attention to the details. There were so many of them that the bus driver had to slow down. It was really quite beautiful, the way they fluttered like ragged dancers. Rasika alighted with the village women who were returning from a day at the fish market. Waving goodbye, she walked the short distance to the little house that crouched under the cliff. Khatru, she called, letting herself into the house. The papers on the dining table had resolved into shapes suspended in the air. Beautiful with the light on them, the papers shivered slightly as though tense from being held up. Student homework, medieval poetry, moths. She didn't know whether to laugh or to be annoyed. Where was he? There, a small round form on her favorite armchair, holding her blue pen and grinning at her with all 64 teeth in view. She began to laugh as the pages cascaded around her. She picked up the papers, setting them on the table, took some of Salma's dal and vegetable soup out of the fridge and put it in a pot to heat on the stove. She sat next to Khatru and tried to gauge his mood. If he was in a bad mood, he would snap at her in warning. At other times, like this one, he merely grinned. He was a pronoun she had assigned him because he reminded her of her dog from her childhood, Badmash, a street dog with one ear and a fierce temperament. Khatru's 2 walking limbs, to call them legs would be an exaggeration, were nearly useless thanks to the injury he had sustained upon crash landing his craft in her backyard. He moved by rolling, steering with a set of small arms. She had never been able to figure out how many arms he possessed because they were half hidden in fine, fur like protrusions. When she took him out on a leash with a supporting harness for his legs, he kept his arms close to his body. I think I should probably stop here, otherwise, it'll get too long.
I really enjoyed that reading. Thanks very much. And if I may, again, pose a general sort of a more specific question, I should say. So, in this story, besides being introduced to this rather wonderful figure of Khatru, the visitor from afar, from outer space, we are also led to explore further, subaltern historiography, which is often much neglected, the history of women's voices, subaltern voices. You lead us to further become curious about gaps in the historical record and important questions relating to women's agency and creative expression are brought to the fore. So this, of course, is woven into this story about a relationship between a human and an alien. So could you elaborate a little bit more on why you chose to bring in this dimension of historiography, and in particular the subaltern aspect in your hand? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This story actually is one of the stories that happened. So, as Anil said, it's hard to kind of, the explanations come in hindsight. So I don't think I was really aware of what I was doing, other than simply wanting to write a story about a woman and an alien. Um, and only she can see the alien in its full alienness. Everyone else perceives the alien differently. But at the same time, when I got to know who this woman was, I realized that she was somebody who was researching women's voices. And I had also been reading, one volume that has been incredibly useful to me as a writer is this 2-volume set called Women Writing in India, 800
Yeah,
BC to the
Tarun.
present, edited by Taru and Lalita. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. It's a way of putting us in touch with our foremothers, right? So through that, I got to know, for instance, about this Bengali poet, sort of almost like a poet of the everyday, the housewife's poet in a sense, Khana. And and so I invented somebody, a poetess called Gyana, who lives in the same time, whose words have been forgotten, except as they are rendered by a young man from that time who writes them down on palm leaf fronds, and that's rediscovered. And so the protagonist of this story, Rasika, is trying to make sense of this forgotten poet Gyana's words. And she actually renders her poetry into free verse, essentially, and tries to make sense of that as well as her own life. And and in terms of relationships. And suddenly I found that the idea of the ocean, because my titles typically come after the story is written, of course the space is an ocean as well. And we use there's the literal ocean, as we have, with global heating and sea level rise. And the protagonist's daughter is off on her own quest in a world that has been troubled and devastated by all of these problems. And then there's the alien, and then there's the voice from the past. And so I found, as I was writing the story, that they seemed to spontaneously come together in this surprising confluence. It was an interesting discovery for me, because I didn't start out intending to write it that way, or having any intention at all.
Right. Yeah, I know it works very well and very beautifully, and especially this exploration also of death as metaphor. I mean, at one level, there is this idea of resistance to erasure and a kind of restoration of historical memory, which comes through so nicely. And at another level, there's this whole exploration of death as metaphor and the contingency of the aliens transformation, which causes us to reflect further on the very notion of alienness. So that sort of works so brilliantly for us, I think, as readers, at least for me. Thank you for that, Vandana. So, Manjula, would you like to go next? Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so my story is in the volume is called The Pain Merchant. It's set in a time when technology exists for recording and playing back physical pain. The protagonist is a teenage boy who makes friends with the eponymous pain merchant, who is a man who makes a living by selling memories of pain. So I'm going to start my reading. It won't be very long. It's written in the voice of the young boy. I was the youngest person in any group of pain traders. They belonged to the earlier world where with their own memories to draw upon. I was the only one amongst them who had been born after the event. I was always desperate to know more about it, why it happened, and how. But their answers were always vague, as if the speakers were embarrassed by the memory. It happened suddenly, they would say, or maybe over a month. It happened by accident or perhaps by design. One day, the scientists had found a way to record pain. The next day, the world's leaders were talking about deleting it from existence. And the day after that, there was an explosion or a leak, something to do with the water, or was it the rain? The one thing everyone agreed upon was the effect. There was no longer any sensation of pain anywhere on the earth. You could fall on your face or step on a nail or swallow poison or poke out someone's eyes, but you felt no pain. There were, of course, consequences. Terrible accidents began to occur. Babies, in particular, died from being crushed or smothered or choked because they couldn't complain in time. A ruptured appendix was a death sentence. Thousands of women died in labor unable to feel their own contractions. Mass murders and group suicides increased 100-fold. No one could have predicted that a world free of pain would unleash such a flood of violence. It was broken, gripped by a madness that nothing could contain. People began living in tiny, isolated, homogeneous communities, clinging tight to those they knew, distrusting all strangers, outsiders. Meanwhile, the technology for recording pain became freely available. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for that. Oh, very beautifully written again. And just before I ask Manjula a question, this is for the audience. So we are approaching the Q&A moment. So please do feel free to type in your questions in the comments section or chat box, as the case may be. And the questions will be relayed across by our team to the authors. I'll read out the relevant ones as they appear. So please, yes, begin thinking about questions from your side. This is for the audience. Okay, now, yes, for Manjula. So this is a story, a very intriguing story, which somehow reminded me of some of the classic stories of the era of magical realism. So it could inhabit a science fictional space because, yes, there is that event, that moment of rupture, which causes this terrible lack of affect to ensue, the inability to feel pain, and for that matter, pleasure. But there's also that strange quality of fabulation to the story. Would you like to say a little bit about the composition of the piece, especially with respect to
in
the way you thought
that,
about it?
Yes, thank you.
Is it a philosophical fable as you conceptualized it?
In the way that I very frequently produce work, I had a deadline to meet. I did not have the slightest idea. I think I had suffered some kind of minor issue and I was in pain. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice? And the story opened out. so so a lot of my writing is like that. I'm very as someone who I meet a weekly deadline with my comic strip. I should point out that I had a deadline to meet today, and I I woke up early enough thinking that I could meet I have a comic strip that appears in a newspaper in Madras, in Chennai, and I forgot space time and decided that I had plenty of time in which to produce it because the deadline is 4 or 5 o'clock Indian time. I woke up and thought, oh, I have plenty of time. I'll just do it before our session. And around 8:30, when I was getting ready to send, I saw a panicked message from my young sub-editors in Chennai saying, "Where's the cartoon?" Because of course I'd forgotten. Anyway, so this is how I often produce work. It's at the last minute. It's done to meet the deadline, and I use whatever resources are right around me, and then it opens out. And for me, the great revelation was that of course, we need pain. And though all of us run away from it, it is crucial to our lives. And as we discover in the course of the story, pain and pleasure are related. If you don't feel pain, you don't feel pleasure.
Yeah, right. Indeed, the story seemed to me about empathy at some level as well. That the absence of pain entails an absence of empathy.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yes, I would. Absolutely.
And of course, while you were speaking of meeting deadlines, I cannot ever erase from my memory bank the sort of experience of receiving at the very last moment your graphic preface, which took months to be completed, but did arrive in such beautiful form. Again, I'd like you, if you could show us those pages, to say a bit more about this idea, because of course there have been graphic novels and comics. Of course, you yourself write many comic strip sort of narratives, but I think this is something quite original. So that's of course the end paper, but the graphic prefix. So the idea of the graphic prefix. So I think it's not been done before, as far as I'm aware, keying in such images with each individual story. And it actually requires a bit of work. You actually have to sort of sit with the numbers.
Anil, this is your item. And
is
it? Of course, yes.
And
of course,
there's Khatru. You can see
Vandana, that is Khatru there.
Khatru. Graphic form. True enough. So please say a few words about the graphic preface and after.
Yeah, well, it was, we are constantly, we means, people in the publishing business are constantly looking for ways to attract attention in the right directions, that is towards the work and not away from it. And I thought, I just thought it would be fun, because Tarun, you had already pretty much done a map of the stories in the book. So how could I possibly add to that, aside from saying, yes, everything's worth reading, everything's good? I mean, obviously I'm going to say something like that. Even though I have to admit, I will say this right now, I don't like all the stories equally. I didn't. But by doing a graphic preface, I'm not making any kind of statement about the stories. They're all represented one way or the other. And it was fun. It was, for me, it was an exploration of, for me, what is I obviously I have a very graphic mental interior, and I enjoy imagining what I read. I mean, what I read unrolls like a film strip in my head always. So it wasn't very difficult to be attempting this. What was difficult was to squeeze everything into one page and one image. And I felt all the time I was doing that, I was very conscious that the authors themselves would probably hate their representation. And that's part of what happens when you deal with other people's work. You can never please them. But I hoped that at least it would provide some, visual thrill, a visually interesting entry into the work. And that at least some people might be looking to see, oh, what is that image keyed to? What is it part of? But
absolutely. As I was about to say, Adam Roberts describes science fiction as a kind of form, particularly marked by visual metaphors. We see that in cinema, of course, and cinema is almost hegemonic now. It's become the mainstream of OTT platforms, especially in Western, Anglo, at least, American spaces.
I'd just like to make one more small point, because before finally allowing Anil and Vandana to talk, that South Asian mythology has given us such incredible forms, such incredible creative and unusual and combinative forms of creatures and styles and visual presences. It seems to me a very simple and obvious thing to do, that we would, in our anthology, also engage with the visual. Anyway, I'm going to stop now.
So it seems we have a question from the audience, which I believe shall appear on the screen. Yes, so I'll read it out. What was the most challenging part about editing this book for you? And for the writers, How do you juggle, balance, or understand being South Asian writers? Do you find yourselves ever thinking about the link between your writing and identity, or are they separate aspects for you? Okay, interesting. Right. So for
Anil,
me,
Anil, you go. Anil, this is your question.
I'll begin because the first part is addressed to the editor. So I'll just say that the most challenging part about editing this book was actually having to leave out some of the submissions. That's always a tough one. Of course, for the most part, we invited contributions from writers whose ability we had confidence in, and most of them, for the most part, they delivered. But the tough part is actually saying no. It's never easy writing a rejection note, especially to an author whose work you respect, and one sometimes feels a bit awkward, but it's part of the game. If you're an editor, if you're in the process of compiling a work with like this, an anthology with best possible contribution, sometimes one just has to be firm and one just has to bite the bullet, really. So that's for me the most challenging. Thank you. Yeah, the second part is to the writers. So who'd like to go next?
Anil, you go.
You're on the spot.
Yeah. No, I don't. It's kind of tricky. I don't think of my what is my identity and how do I position myself. That kind of those kinds of worries. But it shows up in the behavior, in the kind of things I write about, or the kind of things that I read. Then I noticed that there's been a shift. There's been a kind of a conscious attempt to understand the history of the subcontinent, the key works, the kind of works you never studied in school. So you realize that you're going out and looking for these things. And that suggests that there is some kind of re-evaluation going on, right? If there's anything conscious that I do, is that it's trying to eliminate the hostility that seems to be one of those dangerous aspects of such exploration. You end up with a sense of, with a grudge against history. And you try to take it out on the people who exist today. And I think that's a mistake. So because you're not free of it then. You're continuing to be chained to the past. So if there's anything conscious that I do is to understand without feeling, getting, let's say hostile or resentful to the world. I don't think that's a useful thing. In that sense, it is conscious. But otherwise, it's just an attempt to understand more about the world in which I was born and I came in and the stories I read and so on. So it's kind of seamless, sometimes to say.
Right. Thank you for that. Okay. Vandana, would you like to go next? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't consciously think about my identity when I'm writing, because I just have to succumb to the pull of wherever the story is taking me. Otherwise, it won't become a story. But like Anil said, the things that I'm concerned about, the things that I'm interested in, a lot of which have to do with South Asia, inevitably are going to come up in my stories. And in fact, being Indian and being born and raised in India, and even though I live far away right now, I still have multiple entanglements there, personal, professional, and all of that. Spend a lot of time there. That those entanglements will inevitably show up because that's what I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in the kinds of experiments that people have been working on in South Asia, in India in particular. And so it inevitably bubbles up in my stories. And even when I go and play in the wider universe of, maybe far distant, far future planet or whatever, those influences are inevitably going to be there. So in that sense, yeah, you could say I'm a South Asian writer, but I don't consciously think about identity, especially when writing a story.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Manjula, any final thoughts on this question?
Yes, well, I think I will be the outlier because I didn't grow up in India. And in many ways, I find I'm constantly pushing against the definition of being defined as a South Asian. And the result of that has been that I I find my, I mean, this is a statement I'm making about my own work. I find that my point of view is always as the outsider. I am an outsider, not just to the societies. I'm currently living in the U.S. I'm not merely an outsider here. I'm an outsider in India as well. I'm not regarded. I find myself constantly having to step back and kind of uh, recognize that I'm not really part of. And I find myself much more comfortable amongst people who are, but there aren't many people who are in a similar way, not heavily, deeply rooted in whatever is their ethnic culture. I don't feel rooted, and I'm perfectly happy to be unrooted. I mean, I am not one of those travelers who is constantly yearning for some part of my past. I'm not. I'm I've often said that the moment at which I understood my identity was when I watched Star Trek, and I recognized that I would belong on board that deck as an outsider, as an alien, not as an earthling. And that is where I feel comfortable. So that's from Chitrangada Deb, whom I know. Wonderful. She says, wonderful initiative from Hachette. Could the authors kindly comment on how their contributions in this volume are different from volume one? Have their visions altered meanwhile? Nice question. Thank you, Chitrangada. You go, Vandana. I'm going to ask you first.
Well, in volume one, I wrote on a kind of novelette or novella, which was about an old woman who was reflecting back on her past and thinking about a lost friendship, and an old woman who had been an engineer, and a large part of her transformation that I imagined, which was a large scale adaptation to the climate crisis. And this story that is in the current volume is much shorter, and it's about the protagonist is a woman, and it's more about women's voices and about our relationships, including with aliens or potential aliens, or the aliens that we are to each other often. So it's and here the climate crisis appears only as a backdrop in terms of the rising sea levels, in terms of the sea itself becoming different, whereas it's front and center in the story in volume one. So it's just, I think that my concerns are the same, but I do have a variety of concerns and interests. And so this one is highlighting a somewhat different one than the story in the previous volume.
Anil.
Yeah. No, this the second volume is actually a throwback rather than an evolution. It's actually kind of a story that I was working on for quite a while. And I periodically give up on it, and I periodically take it up. It's a kind of story that I would probably not write today if I were to start from scratch, because it is the kind of a hard science question that I'm not particularly interested at the moment. So in that sense, it's a kind of a throwback. Yeah, so, but it came as separate calls, and I did not see the two volumes as linked in that sense. I just saw it as two entirely different volumes, interested in a kind of a common theme, which is about South Asian writers, South Asian writing. So I did not see it as connecting them in any particular way.
For myself, if I might go, because we're running out of time, I would say that there's a huge difference between my story in volume one and volume two, because I was in a different state of mind with volume one. My time pressure was so extreme that it was like gabbling in front of an open mic. I will now confess, I'm not happy with that story. I think it was more like an anecdote. I'm much happier with this time's story. It worked out more organically, and I really felt comfortable with. I have to say this. I really liked the story. And I definitely do like and dislike my own work. It's not that I uncritically adore all my work. I certainly don't. And I would say that this story appeals to me because it's warmer. It's a little more human. As I mentioned, I don't often feel very human, and I felt that this story was an acknowledgement of humanity, of our humanness, in a way that I liked. Thank you for asking, Rangada.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks very much. So we've actually run out of time, but if I may take a few more minutes from each of you. Just one last thought. I know, Vandana can go first. So the last thought was just, well, say a few words about work in hand projects, upcoming projects, what we can expect from you in the near future. So Vandana first. Yeah.
Well, I'm engaged in a very interesting project, which has to do with, it's something called the Climate Imagination Fellowship. Myself and 3 other international writers, all women, and what we are doing is working on climate fictions, and so there's going to be one main story and a string of smaller little flash fiction pieces that's going to come out in the spring of 2022.
So I hope we'll see some time rebels there. part of the mix. Thank you for that.
So too.
Anil?
Yeah. So I have a short story collection coming out, speculative fiction from Hatchet. I think it's called The Inconceivable Idea of Islam. And that's coming out sometime either late this year or probably early next year, most likely. I also have a novel in circulation, and it's that's not a speculative fiction novel. It's a philosophical novel. It's got some philosophical ideas in it, especially Spinoza's work. It's based on Spinoza's book and a writer who is fascinated with Spinoza. So that novel may come out sometime next year. So those are the 2 big projects. Then I'm working on a web series with Pervin Sakit. And that varies. So it may come out next year, it may come out never. So I will see.
Something to look out for. Yeah, look forward. And Manjula?
Well, I have the ongoing 3rd volume of my series, which starts with Escape and the Island of Lost Girls. So it's like it's hanging over my head. It has to be written. But in the meanwhile, I have a collection of published science fiction short stories that I hope will come out next year. I have a collection of my cartoon strips, which again has been pending for a long time, but we're working on it also with Hachette both. And I have, much to my surprise, a non-science fiction novel, a regular fiction novel, which is actually bursting. It's trying very hard to be completed right this minute. It is always pushing to be out now. To be completed, not written yet. So it's like going on all the time. And because I'm living in Newport, Rhode Island in the US, I work with a gallery. So there's a lot of art coming out. So I'm producing a whole lot of art. So I'm in flood. I'm always in flood.
Always wonderful to hear, and we wish all of you the very best. I should flag Usman Malik's forthcoming collection. Well, actually, it's out in some spaces, but yes, we'll get an Indian edition of Midnight Doorways, his collection of stories. Hachette India will bring that out soon, I believe. So that's really something to look forward to. I had the chance to read the stories, and very moving. Like his story, Resurrection Points, in our volume, which I wish we had a chance to discuss with him in person, but maybe at some later stage. Very moving sort of material, very moving stories. So, well, that's our bad luck for today. But thank you to all. I would now leave it to Manjula to give the vote of thanks for today's session.
So being asked to give the vote of thanks, this is something that belongs to the past, but I'd like to propose a very warm vote of thanks to Hachette for making this discussion possible, and of course for Tarun for chivying us to do it, and of course our panelists. And I look forward to the next opportunity and all your work, all the work that lies ahead. And of course, we always have to thank Space Time for allowing us this opportunity. All right, bye for now.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone. Once again, last time we had a physical launch. This time it's virtual, given the circumstances. But such a pleasure. And yeah, so exciting to have you all with us.
Okay. Bye. Lovely to see you, Anil and Vandana. Bye.
Yeah. Same
Likewise. Bye-bye.
Bye.